Welcome to the Real News Network. Wednesday morning, President Barack Obama spoke to the General Assembly of the United Nations, and here's how he began his speech.
We know the future will be forged by deeds and not simply words. Speeches alone will not solve our problems. It will take persistent action. So for those who question the character and cause of my nation, I ask you to look at the concrete actions we have taken in just 9 months.
Now joining us to discuss President Obama's speech is F. William Engdahl. He's the author of Full Spectrum Dominance, Totalitarian Democracy in the New World Order. And I think I got it right this time, William. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Paul.
In his achievements, Barack Obama lays out a few things. He talks about the announcement to close Guantanamo, although, as we know, it's going to take him a lot more time to close it than he thought it would. He talked about ending torture, and I guess to some extent they have, although some people say some of these practices still go on anyway. He talks about Iraq and Afghanistan, but when he talks about concrete achievements, the one thing he didn't talk about is something that happened last week, which is he said they are not going to put missiles in Poland and the Czech Republic, which one would have thought is actually quite a concrete achievement if one's talking about a change of course. So what do you make of this announcement to not put missiles, and are we seeing a genuine change of course here?
Well, I think you put your finger on the most glaring part of the Obama speech at the UN General Assembly, and that was not to mention this reversal of the Bush administration decision on ballistic missile defense, so-called, in Poland and the Czech Republic. Let's step back a little bit and go into the background of the entire BMD project of the Bush-Cheney-Rumsfeld era. And that whole project, which goes back some years before that, is a keystone for a strategy that's been pursued by the Pentagon, hence the title of my new book, Full Spectrum Dominance. The strategy is you have to knock out any serious potential military and geopolitical challenger to United States' sole superpower hegemony in the world. And to do that, Russia is, however battered the Russian military is after the collapse of the Soviet Union back in 1991, one thing they held on to out of national security concerns was a credible nuclear strike force, submarine, air-launched ballistic missile, and so forth. And the only nation in the world until this day that has such a counterforce to the American nuclear arsenal is Russia. That's far more than China. People think, well, China is the big challenger to American hegemony. Economically, China is a very, very large player on the economic scene, but militarily, China's entire nuclear strategy is not at all directed toward any kind of a serious challenge coming from the United States. It's directed toward defensive positions of the China mainland. So Russia is really the key to achieving full spectrum dominance over Eurasia. As Brzezinski, the foreign policy guru in Washington, Zbigniew Brzezinski, said back in 1997 in a famous article in Foreign Affairs from the Council on Foreign Relations, the key to America's continued unchallenged domination in the world is the control of Eurasia. And if the United States allows Eurasia to develop a cohesive economic cooperation, China, India, the countries of the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, and so forth, Russia, the countries of Central Asia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and so forth, Uzbekistan, then that Eurasian constellation has the landmass, the natural resources, the skilled manpower, the scientific manpower, and above all, the population base to dominate the world economy for decades to come. So the strategy of Washington has been, it's unannounced strategy, of course, has been since the end of the Cold War to divide and rule, to pit one part of the former Warsaw Pact countries, Poland, the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Romania, against Russia and to try to encircle Russia with these series of so-called color revolutions that we saw in 2004 with the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Rose Revolution in Georgia that brought this gangster Mikhail Saakashvili into power as de facto a Washington step and fetch it yes boy. And this whole strategy has been designed to, number one, to encircle Russia, and then put into place the missile defense program in Poland and in the Czech Republic with the radar array. And then you have the missing link toward a nuclear first strike capability from the United States. What does that mean, nuclear first strike? Well, this is something the Pentagon, the maniacs like Curtis bombs away LeMay during the Vietnam War or the Korean War, when LeMay and others in the Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to bomb China with nuclear bombs back to the Stone Age and then go on to Russia. The strategy of nuclear first strike hasn't been within reach until now. Now, with the weakened state of the Russian economy after 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the disinvestment in the basic defense profile of Russia, because Russia thought, okay, the Cold War is over, let's peacefully rebuild our economy. We're exhausted. We can't continue this anymore. We waved the white flag of surrender on the Cold War. Let's dismantle NATO. Let's dismantle the Warsaw Pact, which they did, by the way. We didn't dismantle NATO. Instead, we rolled NATO into Eastern Europe right up to the door of Russia. And now Washington is still trying to get Georgia and Ukraine into NATO, which would be perceived as a mortal threat in Moscow. So the ballistic missile defense, if you can grasp this, if one side of two opponents equally matched in nuclear destruction capability develops even a primitive shield that can knock out the second strike of the opponent, the enemy, then they have won on paper, they have won a nuclear first strike war. And that's the whole point. This is not a defensive, a peaceful thing. It's above all, has nothing to do with Iran. U.S. Nuclear experts have stated this in serious scientific documents that are in the public domain, Richard Garwin among them, non-proliferation experts. It has nothing to do with Iran. If you wanted to deal with any threat coming from Iran, you would do what Putin suggested back when the Bush administration made this proposal and claimed Iran was the reason. You would use the Russian radar base installation in Azerbaijan and be right on the border of Iran.
People like John McCain and others, the neocons, have been very critical of Obama's announcement not to put the missiles in Poland and Czech Republic. And so given the historical context you've just given us, how big a decision is this?
I think it's a tactical shift and not a strategic shift. The vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff gave a speech that was largely overlooked by the mainstream media on the same day, where he said, we have developed advanced new technologies and brought them online that weren't in mind when we came up with the proposal for Poland and the Czech Republic. And as well, we are looking at alternative sightings for our anti-missile defense placement, including in the Caucasus, and he mentioned Georgia. So U.S. troops beefing up their presence in Georgia, somehow arm wrestling West Germany and France and other countries in the European NATO side to accept the idea that Georgia, this unstable country, would become a member of NATO, which would then, they would be obliged to go to war potentially against Russia.
Now, are the Americans still, is there any sign of pulling back on the push for Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO?
None whatsoever that I've seen. I mean, had Obama mentioned the dropping of the demand to bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO out of respect for Russia's security concerns, coupled with the Poland and Czech decision, then I would say there is a profound and very healthy rethink going on in Washington. I don't think that's the case. I think they're making a sly tactical move, catching Russia or trying to catch Russia off guard. I don't think the Russians are that stupid, and they're not stupid at all, actually, on these kinds of questions. but it's a tactical ploy to kind of misdirect the debate and try to pressure Russia into squeezing Iran on other issues.
That was part of the announcement. At the time, they said they weren't going to put the missiles into Poland and Czech Republic. They said new intelligence leads them to believe that Iran doesn't have long-range missile capability, so they're going to readjust their strategy to deal with more short-range missile capability from Iran. So what are the U.S. objectives in vis-a-vis Russia and Iran now?
I think the U.S. objective vis-a-vis Iran, you have to take the best would be to look at a map of Eurasia, a political geographical map of Eurasia, including the topography, and going from Russia, China, India, and the Middle East up into Central Asia. And there you see where Iran is situated. You see where Afghanistan is situated. Afghanistan, what's interesting about Obama's strategy since he came into office 9 months ago is his first serious foreign policy decision was to greatly beef up U.S. troop commitments and pressure European NATO allies to beef up their commitments to Afghanistan. Why in the world are we still in Afghanistan? What is that all about? The world has long since forgotten this fellow in the Tora Bora caves called Osama bin Laden, whoever he is. They talk about a Taliban threat in Afghanistan, but the evidence I've seen is most of the so-called Taliban are simply indigenous Afghani tribe groupings that have arms and are trying to get the occupiers out of their homeland, and the U.S. keeps sending more and more NATO troops in. Afghanis, I know several Afghanis, and these are people who are ferociously independent and proud of it. They defeated the Russian army, and I think they're going to defeat the NATO forces in Afghanistan.
But if one follows through on your argument that what part of U.S. strategic planning is to create differences between the countries of Eurasia, don't they need to create some kind of division between Iran and Russia? The current policy is driving them together.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things. They're trying to create a nominal carrot for Russia to ease their anxieties about Poland and the Czech anti-missile placements, which would be a mortal threat to the survival of Russia militarily. I mean, that's a question of minutes away from a nuclear strike. Then, because those missiles in Poland, who's to say they're defensive missiles? They could be nuclear armed as well. So it's totally an untenable thing vis-a-vis Russia. But getting that off the table and saying, okay, now we want you to, put massive pressure on Iran. What will that do? Well, it's going to rupture any trust between Iran and Russia. The whole strategy is, as I said at the beginning, divide and rule. Pit each significant player in the Eurasian continent against the other major players. Russia against Iran, Russia against China. If they can do that right now, that's relatively harmonious.
There's not much sign that they're going to have all that much success getting Russia to help their pressure on Iran.
Well, I wouldn't expect it. I would be surprised if the Russians fell for that. They said earlier this year that was not on the agenda, but we'll have to see.
Well, in the next segment of this interview, let's talk about the other major piece of Barack Obama's speech at the UN, or certainly his major preoccupation with the G20 and the situation at home, and that's the global economic crisis. So please join us for the next segment of our interview with F. William Engdahl.